lost private. We're in Normandy.
Welcome, everyone, to episode 30 of the We're Not Lost Private podcast. My name is Joe Mucci. I'm your host, and I'm pleased to welcome Dev Ramsamy to talk about Navy combat demolition units and Gap assault teams on Omaha Beach on D-Day. You can find us on patreon.com / We're Not Lost Private podcast. You can also find us on YouTube and Apple Music and Amazon podcasts and a whole range of podcast catchers. If you look for us, you can find us in there pretty easily. For $3 a month as a Patreon subscriber, you get all kinds of behind the scenes stuff, documents, photos, etc. It'd be great if you consider joining our team, and also it's great to welcome you.
Thanks for having me, Joe. I'm really excited to share the story of the combat engineers and the NCDUs on across both Utah and Omaha beaches. And there's more to the story than just those two beaches, but there's a lot of information that's not discussed for these particular units on D-Day, but I wanted to shed some light on them and highlight a few stories and some of the heroism that happened with those units. And really, they broke down Fortress Europe. They opened the breach for the rest of the invasion to be successful.
Yeah, you and I exchanged a bunch of emails in preparation for the show, and I think we were very much synchronized on our belief that it's such an underreported
Yeah.
aspect of D-Day, especially with Omaha and Utah. And although there is a plethora of information out there, especially the Navy holdings on this stuff is fairly robust. And I was surprised as I started to do my prep work for the show, doing a lot of research. I also want to point out one of my favorite reference books, Spearheading D-Day.
I have the same.
There you go. This book is an outstanding resource if you're interested
Yeah.
in any of those specialized units that took part in the assaults on D-Day for the Americans. And but for you, I mean, how did you settle on this as a topic of interest for yourself?
You know, I'll kind of rewind it to when Saving Private Ryan first came out, and even before that. My mom got me interested in World War II. She bought me the book from Tom Brokaw, The Greatest Generation. That like instantly hooked me in. And then that summer, Saving Private Ryan came out, and so there's just a 1-2 punch of like really getting into World War II history. But the more I studied the subject of just D-Day in general, it really was, you know, a a, a great combination of really combined arms, right? I will always thank those who worked on Band of Brothers and Stephen Ambrose for bringing that topic to the forefront and really revitalizing World War II. But those stories get told over and over again, and so nothing, not to degrade or denigrate any of the other units like the Rangers or the paratroopers. But this story of combat engineers on D-Day and the naval combat demolition units is largely untold. There's a lot of information out there. It's just not well organized. I think that's starting to change a little bit. But what really got me interested in it is, throughout the annals of history, sappers, pioneers, engineers kind of, really take down the castle, break the fortress, really create that breach for the rest of the armies to really go forth and go through. So, in college, I was an engineering major at first, and just hearing about engineering and that aspect of the military was really insightful. I unfortunately did not get to serve in the military. I have a condition that prevented me from serving, but I find this, being a torchbearer of history and a torchbearer for this group as pretty exciting to carry on that history, and so that it doesn't get lost and untold. But
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I mean, and frankly, the historiography of World War II needs efforts like that, to some of these disparate units, and these guys were very well organized. They were a hybrid unit. They had, both Navy and Army personnel assigned to them, and they really did yeoman's work on D-Day. And you know, a- and and again, you made the point about Saving Private Ryan, and I just guessed it on Paul Woodidge's World War II TV a couple weeks back, and really enjoyed talking with him. And we kind of the show was about 10 myths about Easy Company, and
Yeah.
what we got to do though is we kind of addressed the whole Band of Brothers and to a lesser degree the Saving Private Ryan effect, and Woody and I kind of approach it in a similar tact when we're taking tours out, in that it's the elephant in the room, and I find it's easier to address it right off the bat, and because as I stated on that podcast, the it gives you a visual reference point, so you can kind of factor in what you're reading and then look at it in a different light. It might not always be completely visually accurate, but in this case, um, in Saving Private Ryan's case, you actually see members of Navy combat demolition units being portrayed at the waterline, rigging, starting to rig obstacles, um, and arguing with Miller about clearing that section of the beach off. And then I just did my previous podcast with Charles Herrick, and we talked about Fox Green and Easy Red, that scene
Yeah.
right there where Team 11 came in and really did some great work and are featured in Kappa's photographs. So it's very fortuitous timing to have you on so we can continue that discussion. So
Yeah, it
um
was perfect. I enjoyed that previous podcast with Charles Herrick, and some of the photos he was describing. I'm like, that's Force Team 10 right there, and going in on Easy Red, and so Easy
yeah,
Red and gets
coming right in on the heels of their tank, which had big number 10 written on the back of the air intakes, which was great. Yeah, I thought it was just perfect timing. So if you want, I can bring up your slides, and we can start this off if you're ready.
sure. Yeah, let's go.
Okay,
Or as Ted Roosevelt said on Utah Beach, we'll start the war right here.
that's right. We're going to start the war right here. I'll turn it over to you, and you can tell me, and I'll drive for you, and you
Yeah.
give us all the information you can.
I will. We'll start with this photograph. This is the inside the jaws of death, and it's really fortuitous because when you talk about the first wave, you hear about the exploits, especially on Omaha Beach of the First Division and the 29th and the regimental combat teams. But there's a lot of support units that are attached to those two divisions on Omaha Beach, and similarly at Utah Beach. And a large component of those divisional units have Army combat engineers attached to it, Naval combat demolition unit uh, personnel attached to those units as well. Um, when you start to look into the history of both Omaha and Utah, it's really a tale of two beaches, and we'll get into that here in a second. But you could see, in this famous photo, folks just jumping in the water several hundred yards out from the shingle and the seawall on Omaha Beach. And they're either knee deep in water, some of them are neck deep in water. And, like you said, it was yeoman's work for these units to get started and clear the obstacles. If you want to go to the next slide, there's a couple items I want to highlight here is, how do these units really get created, and what's the legacy of some of these units? When you talk specifically about the naval combat demolition units, they're really the forefathers for the modern day naval SEALs, and so they're known as the Frog Fathers, and so their unit really was celebrated in this past 80th anniversary of D-Day, along with some of the other Army combat engineering units, particularly GAP Team 10 over on Easy Red. But diving into three main highlights here, I want to go to. The first topic is, how are these units created? What are their purpose? Where do they follow on? And then two, how are they really integrated into Operation Overlord, so the D-Day landings, and particularly Operation Neptune, which is the amphibious assault. And then really covering, honoring the fallen here. There's almost 180, I think, known deaths related to these two units. Between engineers and NCDUs, and most of the casualties really happen on Omaha Beach compared to Utah, and we'll dig into that in a bit. But starting with the need for specialized engineering teams when the United States joins the fight after Pearl Harbor and into 1942. High Command, especially Admiral King, really recognizes the need for specialized Navy units, knowing that they're going to fight in the Pacific. And that level of warfare is quite different from what you see in the ETO, in the European theater of operations, and in the Mediterranean theater of operations. But knowing that they would need specialized combat demolition units to take out beach obstacles so that they can perform amphibious assaults, the Navy starts on its path of developing their naval combat demolition unit teams.
I would, in doing a lot of research for a couple of shows I've been doing on the like America's first entrance into combat, and I'm working through some stuff with Operation Torch right now, and I'm noticing that there's not a huge amount of outside of the infantry units themselves. There's not a lot of specialized troops attached to them, and conceptually, when I think about it, I think about the fact you need to master and maintain your combat power. And I think that it was very early understanding that if you have these specialized units that can essentially cause the breach that allows the infantry and armor units to come in after them, and they mass their combat power instead of using it up on the beach on the water line. I think that dawns on our leadership early on, and they're able to react quickly to it. Like you said, Admiral King, who was a master strategic thinker for the Navy at that point. Yeah, it was a stroke of brilliance when he decides to do that, because you need to have those specialized units. And again, I haven't seen much evidence of them in the Torch landings, and the Torch landings were by and large well-contained mayhem. Let's put it that way, in that they didn't have those specialized units, and the landings were kind of a mishmash of small successes and large failures, even though there was not a lot of opposition on the beach. And then you see it start to develop as operations in the Med start to pick up, and there's more amphibious landings going on.
Yeah, I mean, to your point on Torch, prior to that, all throughout 42, both the Army and Navy have these inter-service rivalries of who's gonna land the LVCPs on for the assaulting divisions for any invasion, who's gonna do what, and to your point of King being a master statistician and the stroke of genius he had, it quickly gets settled in 42 that the Navy would be and the Coast Guard will be responsible for landing the troops. And then the next battle is really around, all right, how do you train? Because the Army also stands up its own school in Massachusetts in 42, before it's folded back into Fort Pierce down in Florida, where the Navy's training its personnel for these missions. So the inter-service rivalry is bitter at times, and it still goes all the way up almost to the point of June 6th, where they're trying to still figure out, who's doing what, who's clearing the seaward obstacles and who's clearing landward obstacles. And that fight continues all throughout 1943 and into the spring of 1944. But you could see that both the Army and the Navy really understand the need for specialized units and to really breach the gaps of invasion beaches.
Yeah, and it's the water line that becomes the line of demarcation, essentially,
Yes.
right?
Yeah. So there was even a fight, between the services on, is it the high water, high tide, or low tide? And so, that still gets settled, weeks before Normandy. And, like I said, the Navy's responsible for anything below the shingle, and the Army, the shingle and above. So basically, the high tide above, Army goes. But that inter-service rivalry starts to coalesce and starts to really slim down as the war is progressing. And so you talk about Operation Torch. The Navy has a beach battalion that largely does general engineering principles, and works with the quartermaster to get the supplies on the beach and into the troops, and things like that. The combat demolition units, really, for the Navy, their training is mostly focused, and their resources are mostly focused on delivering personnel to the Pacific. And so what you see is naval combat beach battalions, numbers 1 and number 6, really be dedicated to Europe. 2, 3, 4, 5 really go out to the Pacific, at the behest of General MacArthur and some other leadership out there, as they're engaging more frequently in invasions throughout the Southern Pacific and later Central and Northern Pacific theaters of operation. But what you really see is that as 1943 progresses into 1944, and just the general switch of leadership, Rommel coming back to the European continent after North Africa, and really being assigned to the defense of northern France, and the upcoming invasion in 44 that they anticipate. Largely, the Atlantic Wall up until late 1943 is mishmash of just coastal defenses. It's more of a loose training ground for German units. They don't really get serious until late 43 and late 44, and really putting in obstacles and defending those beaches across that section of Normandy. And all throughout 1944, you could see aerial photography of almost every beach starting to be masked up with obstacles, particularly at Omaha. But there's a famous aerial photograph that you could see the Germans running from the beach inland, and while they're putting in placements, whether it's the Belgian gates, Teller mines, Czech hedgehogs, all those obstacles on the beach. But you could see that the number and the density of those obstacles and the lethality. You talk about the Widerstandness, and you talk about also the minefields. By the time of June 6th, you have 1 million to 1.5 million mines laid between Utah, Omaha Beach, of various types, whether it's Teller mines, other countries type of mines, wooden mines, the shoebox mines. And so you see, like I said, the density of the minefields start to build up, and just the overall beach obstacles start to build up. And
Yeah,
so,
the beaches are and inland as well, so
correct.
excessively reconned by with aerial photography that when they're issued the maps for the regions, it's all pre-plotted down to the obstacle belts, which is
Yeah.
really interesting. And I'll have a bunch of those maps posted up to our Patreon site, so you can take a look and see just what Dev's referring to when we talk about the density of the defenses. But really, they're going to be focused around the exits more than just the large swaths of beaches. And we'll talk. We talked about that a little bit in the last episode, and I'm sure we'll get to it later on.
Yeah. And you talk about the quality, there's a whole myth of, yeah, there's a static division at Omaha Beach, of German defenders, which is not the case. But we'll discuss that a little bit more as we get to Omaha Beach particularly. But all throughout the spring of 1944, the Allied planners really see this buildup happening, and it causes alarm for the engineering special brigades and those commanders there, particularly General Hodge. And what they realize is teams that they've built up are really undermanned at that point. The original units were approximately like 13-man teams. It was a 7-man NCDU unit supplemented by 5-man combat engineers. So around 12 to 13 personnel for what you would ultimately call a gap assault team. And so seeing that build up over 1944, what you tend to see is now that you're going to overstrength these gap assault teams. And so for your listeners, what a gap assault team is there's designated gap points to the exits on each beach. On Omaha, there's about 16 exits. On Easy Red, the subsector of Omaha Beach, there's particularly 6 exits assigned to that beach just because of the width of and the length of the beach there. Those gap assault teams grow from 13-man units almost to 40-man units, comprised of 25 Army engineers and roughly 13 or 14 Navy personnel from NCDUs. And so those two put together really create a gap assault team. So they're charged with clearing a 50-yard wide gap in the line that goes 300 yards from the water line all the way to the shingle. And like I mentioned, there's 16 of those on Omaha Beach. And what those teams do are really, clear the gaps and expand that gap to eventually clear all the obstacles on the beach. And then once that mission is done, really the Army engineers are to push forward into the dunes inland and really clear the minefields. And the minefields are really, that's when you start to get the gap support teams that are follow-on units for that. So you can see that it's not just the 1st Infantry Division and their regimental combat teams. It's the 1st Infantry and the 29th plus support. So when we go back to the training, I do want to highlight here there's a continual shortage of engineers and training programs throughout the war because you have 2 competing fronts. You have Pacific, Mediterranean slash European theater. And so the Pacific is consuming a lot of the Navy resources. And the Army is still trying to figure out through 43 and 44 how to really organize itself, what should be the complement of these units, and how should they take down German obstacles for the invasion. Where you really see, some of the successes of this training is in Operation Husky when they invade Sicily. And so the 1st Beach Battalion and their engineers really participate in that invasion. They were included in Operation Torch, but they have a more prominent role in Husky. And those lessons are applied to Overlord. And so the planners learn from there what goes well, what goes wrong. And there's a few good examples of what goes well. And they start to see that between combined arms and combined forces of the Army and Navy, they can get communications down pretty well. Right. Still during this time in 43 in the early part of 44, there's still a lot of operational and tactical questions to be answered, as we talked about earlier. Who does what from seaborne to landside, and who's bringing in the troops. But what you see from all these trainings is the training at Fort Pierce eventually becomes an Army-Navy training center for both services. A lot of the units deploy from Fort Pierce or along the east coast and deploy to England for further invasion training. Near Slapton Sands, near Devon in southwest England, and so they continually go through training, even so much so that you start to get into not areas of overtraining, but now you start to create a little curiosity between German reconnaissance. And so, if you know where I'm going with this, it's Operation Tiger, Exercise Tiger.
Yep.
And so, Exercise Tiger really is, a rehearsal for the invasion. Happens in Slapton Sands in April '44, and it's where that training invasion force gets ambushed by E-boats from the German Navy, and sink a couple, I believe it was LCT. And on that LCT, what happens is there's a complement of engineers that are assigned to Force U, and Force U is Utah Beach. And so there's roughly about 145 casualties, particularly on the engineering side, that Operation or Exercise Tiger really affects. And so you lose that knowledge and you lose that manpower on that exercise. And at the time, it was highly classified. They didn't want that exercise to be well publicized, well known. It got buried. And so it caused a lot of alarm in high command, especially with Eisenhower's team, and particularly Bradley's team, of who knows what is there an intelligence leak and what does this do for invasion preparations?
Yeah, there were quite a few MIAs from that, and they were worried that the plans might have been compromised if the Germans had recovered, anything from any of the bodies that had been missing up to that point. So, like you said, they had buried it and classified it for so many years. I think it was only several decades ago. It really was fully acknowledged, the amount of damage that those E-boats did to the U force. But yeah, I mean, and now there's a monument there at Slapton Sand, if I remember correctly,
Yeah,
one
there's
of the
one.
recovered Shermans. But yeah, like you said, this had a sobering effect on the leadership at that point in time. But it also, like you were inferring, it weakened the availability of combat engineering units for the landing because of the amount of casualties.
Yeah, I mean, there's concern about do we have enough shipping tonnage? Do we have the right number of craft to land? And that had been always a concern into 42, 43. When America joins the war in 42, you have Operation Bolero, which is, a 42 cross-channel invasion. But the American forces are nowhere near trained. They don't have the resources to really complement that. And so, um,
I think you'll
you,
find, just to reinforce that point, about the shipping, is they're constantly playing this shell game with shipping, right? They have to move,
yeah,
they conduct operations in Italy and the mainland, and then they have to move all that shipping back up to England to get it staged because they were already starting to do the planning work for Overlord. So I mean, there's this constant shell game, and I think that also influences how the engineer special brigades are used because they need to clear the obstacles to protect the shipping going in because it's a finite resource. So I mean, there's a lot of emphasis that gets put on that.
yeah. And I think that speaks to, my earlier comment of overstrength of these units. So while you had 16 total NCDU units, the complement of sailors attached to those units was around 7 to 8 personnel. And then that doubles effectively prior to the invasion. Um, they do have trained units that go there, but to supply the overstrength. And then the same thing happens to the Army combat engineers is how do you get that overstrength? You have a lot of training that's done stateside, but it's not the same type of beach setup as you would have when you're transferred to England for that training. And you have training all the way to 6 weeks prior to D-Day, because you have pretty green forces in that scenario. Whereas, we talked about the first Naval Beach Battalion. They had limited experience in Torch, more so in Husky. Now comes the big show with Overlord. And so training, it becomes the mantra of the day. And they're training not just on invasion, tactics and practices, things like that. They're also on top doing demolition work and training. And so you're handling explosives in a very stressful environment. Um, and it's just another compounding effect. So the training component really goes to when you start to get to D-Day itself and you understand the assignments of what the beach obstacles look like and the amount of equipment these guys have to carry. I have a few, replica pieces, but they're carrying a tremendous amount of weight on them. So if you're looking for a fast assault, an example of a fast assault, D-Day is not that operation for a lot of the units that come on shore.
Yeah,
Um,
I was reading the account of one engineer from first ESB, and he was talking about by the time with it including his mine detector, he weighed about 300 pounds. I mean, you're going to jump off the ramp of a landing craft in a depth of water that you don't know, and you weigh 300 pounds. Like you're going right to the bottom like a rock. I mean, these poor
it's
guys.
Yeah, it's incredible. If you want to jump over to the next slide real quick,
Yep.
we're talking about what they're carrying with them on D-Day, and here you have a photo of embarkation prior to D-Day. I think this photo is taken June 4th or 3rd, as troops from the marshaling yards go to the ports to get on those ships that are going to head over to Utah and Omaha. And so I've read various accounts of the loads. You talk about with the mine detector equipment that gentleman is weighing 300 pounds. The standard assault load for D-Day, just the basic rifle, basic load of ammunition that they're carrying, which is roughly 196 rounds of 30-06. Couple hand grenades, 2 days worth of rations, you name it, chemical warfare material. Um, that basic load itself is between 35 to 40 pounds. Now, these guys are taking extra ammunition, extra equipment with them based on their role and their duty, whether it's, carrying those Bangalore torpedoes, carrying mine detector equipment. If they're a mortar team, they got to carry the base plates, the tube, the extra mortars that are attached to that.
Pole
And
charges, flamethrowers.
all that equipment, all of it. So I've seen, various sources say they've taken approximately, so that's a standard load for an engineering team in an NCDU unit. Um, they're carrying between 40 and 75 pounds of explosives on top of that. So you're
Yeah,
easily over
you got your
100
40-pound
pounds.
satchel charge. You got Primacord reels. I mean,
Yeah.
blasting caps. I mean,
I mean, look,
it's amazing.
I've got one of
Fuses.
my, this is an actual, um, blasting machine from World War II, and most of the folks on Utah Beach can't carry these. The Force O or Omaha Beach actually carried pull cords, detonators, but this thing right here weighs over 5 pounds itself. Right, and you're charging it. That's just one piece of equipment to get, the engineering. You have a galvanometer here that tests the charge, and so that's another pound or two that's taken in weight. And so you start to add those things up. I got a couple blocks of blasting caps. I've got, some TNT. It is a replica, but these are half-pound charges.
Yep.
Then you got some of the C2. Um, and 1 pound charges, right? And so you're not just carrying these, as 1 or 2 pounds, you're carrying as satchel charges and sacks that weigh, 20 pounds, 40 pounds. You have the little haggis impacts that are 1 pound, basically bombs, and you're carrying a satchel of those as well. And so you can see these soldiers here. They're carrying their basic load, and you can see they're starting to be overloaded. You can see the spools of primacord. Each one has two satchel charges on each shoulder. And then, there are other basic assault equipment. The gas mask is prominently displayed on their chest. They've got the flotation device around their waist. Many of them are carrying sections of Bangalore torpedoes. And so, you
Plus
start to
their
put,
rifles, plus their impregnated uniforms. I mean, it's all. I mean,
yeah,
it's all uncomfortable.
yeah, it is just, it's remarkable how, one, they got into their landing craft, and two, how they get out of their landing craft.
Yeah, and these
Um,
men are not even part of a crew-served weapons team either, so it's not like
yeah,
they're a mortarman or a machine
no,
gunner and they're already heavily overloaded.
yeah. So, you start to think about, and these folks are not weighing 200 or 300 pounds themselves as an individual, person. Some of these guys, I interviewed one veteran back on the 75th anniversary of D-Day. His name's Richard Dietz. He landed at Utah Beach. He's like, son, I weighed $125 and I had just as much weight and equipment on me. So he's walking off as a 250-pound guy, into basically waist deep or even neck deep water, in certain cases. So you talked about the impregnated uniforms. They're really wearing two sets of uniforms. They're wearing cotton underneath and a wool set, uh, as well, that's impregnated with the chemical protection. So, one, that stuff stinks. Two, it traps in heat.
Traps, yeah.
Yeah, and and if you're wearing wool and you get that thing soaked, there's another weight detriment that you have trying to crawl off the beach, or you're jumping in the water and you get soaked like that. So, there's a tremendous amount of equipment the engineering teams and the NCDUs use, that they use. And it really depends on, what their assignment is that day. So, for example, you do have engineers and units really trying to blast through um, German bunkers and German large fortified bunkers to get through several feet of concrete. So you got folks who are carrying a pole charge with a 40-pound explosive that they're supposed to, align to the wall. Or you've got teams who are blowing up Belgian gates, and that
Yeah,
requires,
yeah. The pole charges are always interesting to me. Obviously, they have essentially a platter charge of TNT at the front of it on a pivoting head with a double or a redundant fuse mechanism and primacord attached to it, which is really interesting. And these poor guys, and you could see it again. I'll point to Saving Private Ryan. There's a sequence when the Miller character is starting to run towards where that big bunker is, and you can see there's a soldier with a pole charge on his shoulder run right past him. So I got to give them a lot of kudos for making sure that got depicted correctly.
yeah. And you asked me earlier, how I got interested, seeing all the equipment and like all the explosions and what they're doing, the Bangalore torpedoes. For a 13-year-old back then, that's really exciting stuff. So, and I'm like, I want to go in the army. I want to do that. And so that's where, the impetus comes from. But more research, these men who storm the beaches and what they've done. I can't emphasize the importance of them being really the first wave and the tip of the spear to really break through so that subsequent waves could come through and really breach into the Atlantic Wall, this feared Atlantic Wall that all the German propaganda says is going to stop us at the beaches. These damn few really take the burden of the invasion force. And so when we talk about carrying the load physically, they are also carrying a large load to make sure that, one, they don't get stranded on the beach. They have to clear those obstacles for the LCTs to come through, the LCIs to come through, and ultimately larger ships. And so they know the importance. They know that they're heading into some of the deadliest fighting that stands before them. And I say that because, um, about a week prior to D-Day, these units start to get their assignments at the, frontline level, and they understand that they are going to be the tip of the spear, like I said. But they also start to hear that the Navy's going to do this pre-bombardment and it's going to destroy everything. So this should be a cakewalk. They hear the same thing from the air forces that, oh, we're going to bomb them to submission. You should have plenty of places to, duck into a foxhole. You should be able to clear the beaches. There shouldn't be a German soul living on any of
Yeah,
those
there should be
beaches.
craters for you to take cover in if
Yeah,
you need it. Yeah, none of that happens.
none of that happens.
All the bombs dropped inland, because they're worried that they're going to drop those bombs on our forces going in. So they just toggle them out into the French countryside instead of doing what they were supposed to do, which is paste the German defenses.
Yeah,
So these guys show up and all of the things they've been promised don't occur. And unlike, say, your standard rifleman out of the 1st Division or the 29th, these guys are walking bombs. Like, I remember reading one account of one of the NCDU units. It was a boat team literally running on the beach with their rubber assault boat filled with 300 pounds of explosives, and the explosives get hit and it essentially disintegrates the entire boat team.
yeah. I
I
mean,
mean,
that is the unfortunate thing, right? Um, Part of that carrying the load is they do have these rubber dinghies that are filled with hundreds of pounds of explosives and additional equipment. And you're right, yeah, they get hit with artillery on a direct hit. I think about especially on Easy Red, there's an LCI 85. It hits a beach obstacle about 200 yards out from the high tide, and it gets stuck there. And while it gets stuck there, the Germans really find and zero in on LCI 85, and just shell the heck out of the ship.
yeah,
All the fires drawn to LCI 85. There are dozens of dead on the decks. It fortunately is able to pull back out, go back to the USS Samuel Chase. They're the commanding officer of LCI 85, and the commanding officer of the USS Chase start to get an argument because LCI 85's commanding officer is like, "Hey, I'm going to drop off my dead here. I'll try to go back, but we're so badly damaged. I don't think we're going to make it." Eventually, the disagreement ends. They unload the dead, but the ship LCI 85 is taking on water, doesn't really make it back. It does eventually sink. It's one of the few LCIs that sink on D-Day itself. But to your earlier point about shipping, it's those types of smaller craft that the allies are and the high command's really worried about because they don't have deep water ports. They're going to have to land stuff onto the
on
beaches.
the beach. Yeah.
Tons of material. You think about a tank division, you think about the fourth armor or the fourth infantry, all the infantries and the following divisions that are coming later on D-Day. They take tons and tons of manpower and equipment and to get settled. So it's precious cargo and shipping with those smaller craft that, like you said earlier, are they're playing a shell game because 3 months or not even 3 months later, they're landing in southern France, and a lot of those same vehicles and ships are used in that similar invasion down in southern France in Operation Dragoon. So
Yeah.
it's
Yeah,
important.
there's a constant competition between the Pacific theater and the European theater of operations for that shipping. And there's plenty of accounts of amphibious assault ships of various types going between both theaters. So I mean, it really, again, it goes back to that shell game, but they have to protect them because, as you stated, they're precious in that they're hard to replace. I mean, I think the folks that are listening to this or watching this have seen plenty of photos of, from the invasion beaches of the beached ships waiting for tide to come back in, so
Yeah.
that they can retract and shove back off. But I mean, but these guys, without these guys, they can't get anywhere near the beach.
Yeah. And so the clearing operations, particularly on Omaha, um, I would say that the effect is miraculous, just given when you, if your listeners have ever been to Normandy and have walked the bluffs outside of the Normandy American Cemetery, you're near, I believe, WN 65 in that section of the beach, and you look at that bluff and you could see you have an open field of fire. You could see what's coming at you, and if a lot of the German emplacements are pre-sighted, and so they understand their fields of fire really well. Um, it's one, a miracle that anyone got off the beach, let alone the engineers, and two, that they were able to overcome. If the certain German command decisions were different that day, if Rommel has total operational control type of thing, they may have thrown folks off the beach from the Allies' perspective. And so the work is not easy here. So let's kind of jump into Utah versus Omaha
Okay.
because it is a tale of two beaches here. And so Utah really has two designated beaches, Uncle Red and Tar Green. Um, and so the miracle at Utah, through the miracle of navigational errors and currents, is that force force U and its complement of assault infantry and engineers land up to 2 miles farther south than their intended planned beach. And so the planned beach has a lot more obstacles, defensive positions, and nests to really guard that sector. Where they land about 2 miles south is more lightly defended. And so when the assault troops land, um, it's not as chaotic as you would see in Saving Private Ryan, where that depicts Omaha Beach. Needless to say, there is resistance. There is artillery firing on the beach. They're still exposed to that kind of shell fire, and there are still machine gun nests and defensive positions that are laying down fire, but not to the degree and intensity that you would see later on in Omaha Beach. And
Mhm.
so um, Assault Force U lands same time at Utah that they would land at Omaha, 6:30 a.m. And the first engineering troops and then NCDUs really land about 5 minutes later. So 6:35 a.m. is their planned assault on the timetable schedule. You compare that to Omaha, and they land 3 minutes or 3 minutes after H hours. So in Omaha, they're landing at 6:33 as the first wave of gap teams. And so for Utah, they're able to clear their obstacles um, relatively easily within the first 3 hours. And by um, H hour plus 15 hours, they've largely cleared Utah Beach of almost all the obstacles, and they have landed the entire fourth division before midnight. And so, and the fourth is pushing inland and making, connections with the airborne infantry inland, whether it's St. Mary Glace and other prominent towns in that sector of Normandy.
A factor that does not exist behind Omaha Beach, which, obviously it helps to lessen the incoming fire on Utah Beach because you've had that airborne assault behind them, and it's keeping the Germans occupied and taking out artillery positions, whereas you don't have that same phenomenon happening at Omaha.
Correct. And, that diversionary tactic really assists um, the successful landings at Utah. The one of the key differences I would say between a Utah and Omaha, while assaulting the beach was relatively easy, they're able to clear the obstacles. What lie ahead for the subsequent landing divisions, particularly the remainder of the fourth, and then divisions later on D+1 and 2, is the large minefields inland. And so that's where the Army engineers really make up their ground and really get kind of bogged down, is just the density of those minefields, and they're dense on both Omaha and Utah. But for Utah, that's where they really experience a lot more casualties in the mine clearing um, operations after D-Day. There's relatively few casualties on Utah Beach itself. I want to say the number is around 150. I think it's 147 to be exact, but around 150 total casualties. Very few engineers are killed, wounded, or injured um, on D-Day itself at Utah Beach. And so that is a remarkable difference than on the results of Utah Beach when you compare it to Omaha Beach. So when you start to look at the overall engineering complement, so the ESB, they're able to start beach operations fairly quickly on D-Day. So they're bringing in supplies, they're bringing in the subsequent waves. The Army engineers, like I said, are pushing inward quite rapidly, but they're experiencing resistance on those minefields. So there's minefields all along behind the beaches at Utah. Now you start to look at Omaha itself. And Omaha, like I said, is a tale of two beaches. And Omaha, across the board, is more heavily defended. It has a denser obstacle belt than Utah. And I don't know if you've ever read Adrian Lewis's book on Omaha Beach. He talks about some of these failures where, yeah, we know about the failures of the Air Force, delaying their bombs and them hitting inland. Talking about um, the short naval artillery bombardment not being long enough to really make an effective use of that time. That's where you see some of the heroics of some of those destroyers coming further
Yep.
inshore and almost beaching themselves to get at some of those particular defensive positions that the Germans are holding. But there's a couple of intelligence mishaps that happen. One is a failure to really appreciate that there's not just, I believe it's 752nd Division that is considered a static division, but the 352nd Division, which is based out of St. Lo on the German side, they are actually moving units up into defensive positions across Omaha Beach as well. And so the 352nd does have combat experience from other operations in Europe. They do provide another defensive layer on Omaha Beach. So there's a underestimation of the strength of troops at Omaha Beach. And like we talked about earlier, they're continually building up the obstacles on Omaha. Now, where you see that deployed is really on particularly easy red. And that's kind of where a lot of my research focuses, because one, there's a tremendous amount of casualties for these support units, for both the NCDUs and for the Army units. And when I say a tremendous amount, that on average, it's over 50%. Now, some boats, like you mentioned, just totally get wiped off the map. Some boats have almost 95-100% casualty rate because they hit an explosive and it wiped out the team. Omaha becomes not just somewhat of a misunderstanding of the opposing forces, but there is disagreement on the Allied command side that should we really land at dawn? Shouldn't we land at 2 or 3 in the morning, and earlier in the dark? Kind of like we did in Operation Husky. So we landed under the cover of darkness, those early assault teams, and that led to some of the successes. Well, the disagreement at Allied Command is no, we're going to land at 6:30 in the morning with light, make a frontal assault. Obviously, there's frontal assaults across the board on each of the beaches, but you laid out a key point here. You had airborne infantry in the back of the beach, Utah beach, causing chaos and confusion and tying down any reinforcements that would head over to defend the beach at Utah. You really don't have that same effect on an Omaha beach. So you're getting the full frontal force that's ready to fight when American troops land. Now, I mentioned that they land NCDUs and Army engineers.
But Dev, just to back up real quick on that, the idea about landing at 2 or 3 in the morning, they also have the tides to contend with, because they want to land at a certain point in time where they know that they're going to have maximum amount of beach time for when they do bring in the larger vessels. But I would point out the visual reference system for naval gunfire at that time. In order to have those supporting arms, they need daylight. It's not like nowadays. So that's a key consideration too when they decide to make the decision to go during the day, or at least early morning.
Yeah, very, very good points there. And you're absolutely right. We talk about the combined arms, right? And really the combination of the Air Force bombardment or naval artillery support, it leads to that decision to land during daylight. And so I contend that I agree with some of Adrian Lewis's insights here that the naval bombardment could have been longer. But what's the trade-off? You're trying to get some surprise there. And so
Yeah.
where I go with that is some of those gap teams land and actually don't meet any resistance. They land, they're tying up their explosives, they're doing their engineering work. They don't get noticed almost for a whole half hour towards 7 o'clock until the first shot goes off of explosives. That's when the Germans really realize, hey, there's something going on here, and they divert their attention to those to those gap teams and the subsequent waves of infantry that are assaulting the beach. There's chaos across the board, but that first shot does go off. And so when I start to talk about Easy Red is where Gap Assault Team 10 comes in. And Gap Assault Team 10, if you want to go to the next slide, is led by two individuals here. One is Lieutenant Joseph Gregory, who's pictured on the left-hand side, and Ensign Lauren Karnowski, who's pictured on the right. And so these are the two leaders. Lieutenant Gregory represents the Army engineers, and Ensign Karnowski represents the NCDUs. And so they lead GAP Team 10. Karnowski leads NCDU unit number 45. And so these two gentlemen here are responsible for the gaps on Easy Red. And so their 41-man team lands actually ahead of schedule. So while the schedule says they should land at 6:33 a.m., they land about 8 minutes prior to that. And so they land around 6:25, and that's even earlier than the first infantry assaults on the timetable. So they land, they get started. Their teams start working on beach obstacles, and about 20 minutes in, NCDU 45, which is a part of GAP Team 10, ignites and their explosives and take out their first obstacles near E1 exit. So near I believe WN62 is where E1 is. And so WN62, there's actually two defensive nests that guard that E1 draw. And so they being the Germans know that those draws are really the only way that the invasion force is going to make it inland. So they really concentrate their defensive positions on those exits and draws for Omaha Beach. But at Easy Red E1 um, would be the most prominent draw for both the Allies and for the opposing German forces. But these two leaders, as you mentioned, yeoman's work. They get to um, uh, detonating and clearing beach obstacles. The Army component, led by Lieutenant Gregory, sets off their first shot about 20 minutes after Ensign Karnowski. So about 7:10 in the morning, in that time frame, they start clearing their obstacles. This is when they start drawing heavy German fire at E1. So the artillery's dropping, the machine gun nests are roaring, and the casualties start to pile up. And so this is the same section of beach that I mentioned where LCI 85 is attempting to land
Yep.
so that they could help support the initial GAP teams that were assaulting. And so
And this is where Kappa will come in later on in a later wave, and he actually takes pictures of their men doing their work, which is
yeah,
pretty phenomenal when you think about it. Like I said, if my listeners and viewers will go back and watch episode 29, Chuck does a really good job of describing that, working through the pictures, especially the NCDU guys that are clustered around the hedgehogs, and you can see the primacord rigged between the obstacles as they go about attaching their explosives. It's pretty amazing.
yeah, I love that you had Charles on as the previous episode, and he actually talks about Gap Team 10 specifically, and specifically these two leaders. And I was a little worried there that I was going to steal some thunder, but I was happy that he acknowledged what Gap Team 10 is there for and what they're really doing at Easy Red, and then that is just further supported by Kappa's pictures there. And it's amazing you can see that prima cord in the water and kind of demarcating, how much prima cord is being used and how many obstacles. And I think Saving Private Ryan actually does a good job of kind of representing that Kappa picture there, because you could see the cluster of infantry kind of huddling around, those obstacles, which does present problems for these GAP teams across the beach.
Yeah.
As
They can't blow the shots if these guys are all over the obstacles.
Yeah,
They need them to
and
get up and get out, get up to the seawall essentially, so they can clear these obstacles out of the way.
what you see is the way the invasion is designed is as a conveyor belt. So every couple minutes, there's another subsequent wave, whether it's the DD tanks, whether it's another engineering combat battalion, whether it's another wave of infantry, assault infantry. So every few minutes, you have, Coast Guard boats dropping off troops, pulling back out.
Yeah,
Hopefully,
it's a
they're
very
not.
tight timeline for all this, and it's very choreographed.
So the problem that you start to see, and like Saving Private Ryan depicts, you start to see the buildup of subsequent waves. And so who's going to push in? And I think there's the great, opening scene. And Tom Sizemore says, 5 men is a juicy opportunity. One
Yeah,
man is a waste of ammo type of thing. And it emphasizes the point, like, you got to get off the beach.
yeah. You can't cluster up, and you got to move out.
Yeah. And so because that clustering effect starts to happen early on, it hinders the work of the GAP teams. They're not able to clear as much or as many of the obstacles. And we remember we talked about the density. So all the way from underwater obstacles up to the shingle, there's just varying degrees of obstacles, both check hedgehogs, mines interlace that, barbed wire later on, closer to the inland positions. But it's designed to cause chaos for an assaulting force. And as troops build up, you don't have those gaps to really push that shipping for subsequent waves in. So you have this waves just standing offshore saying to themselves, well, do I go in now? Do I create, more chaos? And to your point, the timetable is such that it's a very tight timetable. So what happens here with Gap Team 10, I think, is extraordinary and remarkable. And they're able to get their charges off. They're able to do their work and really open E1, which is one of the primary draws for Omaha Beach. What that allows the invasion to do is to actually bring the heavier equipment on board, so the naval beach battalions can start working with quartermaster operations and start bringing the supplies, landing the reinforcements on Omaha Beach. And so these two gentlemen here, let me tell you a little bit about each one of them. So Lieutenant Joseph Gregory, he is from my home state of Nevada. So it was remarkable for me to find his story. There's not a lot of Nevadans, just because of the population back 80 years ago in Nevada that, have served. But Lieutenant Gregory's from Elko, Nevada. He's in northern Nevada. He is about 25 years old at the time of the invasion. And so he joins the Army Corps of Engineers back in 42. He's married young, and serves all the way up until D-Day. Unfortunately, he gets hit after clearing a large portion of the beach obstacles. He gets hit by an artillery shell 5 feet in front of him, and it kind of just rips his stomach open. He knows he's mortally wounded, and Karnowski is there by his side and actually perishes next to him. And Karnowski, was reassuring him that he did a great job, and really made a difference. What you see with Lieutenant Gregory, though, is just a commitment to his men before being hit by a German shell. He is wounded in the thigh by gunfire and still continues demolition operations, clearing the obstacles, and really being a cheerleader for his men to push forward, keep going, even as they keep sustaining casualties. And for his service on D-Day, he is posthumously awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, and that is only second to the Medal of Honor, which I think is quite remarkable. So it gives me chills to talk about him. Highly respect the work and the sacrifice by Lieutenant Gregory. Ensign Karnowski receives the Navy Cross. He joins the service after graduating civil engineering school in 1943, joined shortly after that. He's from the state of Kansas, and so he's pictured there in his naval uniform prominently. And for his service, like I said, he receives the Navy Cross. He subsequently goes on to serve throughout the remainder of the war, and he goes and serves in Korea as well. Unfortunately, he passed in 1992, but is widely recognized by the Navy for his contributions on D-Day. And so,
In surviving, I think we have one of the most interesting artifacts that come out of D-Day. He hand drew a map on a piece of V-mail of the
yes,
sector of Easy Red where they were operating, and I actually got a copy, a picture of it for our Patreon subscribers. I'll have it posted up on the website for everybody to take a look at. It's pretty remarkable because I believe he has Lieutenant Gregory's positioned notated on there as well. It's a pretty interesting drawing. I'll post it up for everybody.
Yeah, it's very remarkable, especially because he draws it. I want to say 6 or 8 weeks after D-Day, sometime in like the July timeframe. He draws
But the
that map.
but the level of detail on it is remarkable for something that, that distance of time between the action and when he drew it, the detail's really remarkable.
Yeah, it's a pretty interesting piece of 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 history, and so it's incredible what they did. Those two gentlemen leading their teams forward. Um, I'm just going to read to you a small excerpt of what they actually did on D-Day, and uh, your viewers can quickly Google search Vincent Karnowski for additional details. But um, they were. I'll read from the middle. Um, Lieutenant Gregory and his men pulled off their rubber boat, and so we talked about the rubber boats full of explosives, and they let it go. Then they headed for the dune line and their obstacles. We disembarked as two 88 millimeter shells dropped near our LCM and got busy tying charges to our assigned obstacles. Two of my men, this is Karnowski talking about his after action report. Two of my men tied the rubber boat with our demolitions to a piling. And the first shot or the first detonation fired at 650 hours. It went magnificently. Smoke billowed and the obstacles were blown to bits. Machine gun fire erupted immediately, keeping us on our bellies. My top man, Chief Conrad Millis, couldn't resign himself to crawling, too slow for him. So he took off running with a roll of primacord and quickly placed several more charges. But unfortunately, machine gun fire cut him down. He was the only man I lost that day, the best one I had, and it took him longer to prepare and detonate the second shot because the tide was coming in fast, and infantry, 10 minutes behind schedule, were filtering through us. I just had enough time as our danger flare went up to grab a soldier from one of our charge pilings before a second shot went off at 0705 hours. During the time, gunner's mate Bob Svedston carried wounded fellow gunner's mate Gail Faint all the way to the dune line with a machine gun fire chasing him the whole way. Now in water up to our knees, we were almost to where Lieutenant Gregory and his men had started. And if you look at a map of Omaha Beach, that's approximately what they call the Roman ruins.
Mhm.
And the Roman ruins are a square between, I believe, WN 65 and 62, not far from Lambert's Rock. If you know Ray Lambert, he's
Yep.
a medic.
Yeah,
Medic.
between 62 and 64, if I remember correctly.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. So, and we'll cover in the next slide here in a second, but I'll finish this story real quickly. Um, They got to Lieutenant Gregory. They'd done a great job clearing the entire 50-yard gap. Several pilings were made between our two sectors, and Lieutenant Gregory insisted on getting them. A tall man, he waded and swam to each piling as he threw the charges to him. Triggering each one separately, he destroyed all three. Jerry Shellfire is now really pouring in, coming in on the almost high tide, where bodies, jeeps, tanks, and small boats were piling up on the beach. Three LCIs, landing craft infantry, spotted our gap and came on in. While they unloaded, we loaded out our wounded. By this time, most had been lost, and 5 others from NCDU 45 were wounded. The situation became worse as we lay behind the dunes. Then one of the soldiers spotted a Jerry to our front on a footpath and took on after him. His fellow infantrymen followed. Lieutenant Gregory and I rounded up our remaining men and sent them ahead to the hillside for protection. An emergency first aid station had been set up near the path and wounded were being treated. We were nearing it when a large shell scored a direct hit. Gregory, 5 feet in front of me, was hit badly in the stomach and legs, and I rolled him over to attend to his wounds. He kept saying he wouldn't recover. We talked about the beach job. He was happy that he had completed our assignment, and then he collapsed and died. So that's from the words of Vincent Karnowski. Um, in description of, his after action report. And you mentioned the map. I believe the map was part of that after action as well. So um, I honor Lieutenant Gregory, who's part of the 146th Engineering Combat Battalion, and it was the officer in charge of GAP Team 10. So
That's
there,
pretty powerful excerpt you read, and in that it focuses on mission accomplishment, but it doesn't dehumanize itself doing so. You read a lot of after actions, and they're very dry. That one definitely doesn't lose its humanity in the covering of the actions.
yeah, I think you see a lot of heroism through a lot of the GAP teams on D-Day. And so when you look at some of the casualties, we talked about the high casualty rate for both the Army side and the NCDUs. Uh, when you look at the NCDUs that day along Omaha Beach, they had sent roughly 175 personnel uh, onto the beach. The Navy overall on June 6th had for the NCDUs both on Utah and Omaha, with Omaha taking the majority of casualties, had a 52% casualty rate. And when you break that down, it's about 31 dead and 60 wounded. NCDU 45 specifically, which is a part of GAP Team 10, suffered a 50% casualty rate. One was killed in some Melissa, as I mentioned in the report out, and then 6 that were wounded, 1 seriously and 5 that were slightly wounded. But needless to say, that the number of casualties um, through that experience was very high for both Army and Navy engineering units on that day. And so um, while there are a lot of casualties, the success of that day is amplified by all beaches being taken, both Utah, Omaha, and on the Canadian and UK side. That being said, why I focus on NCDU 45 and GAT Team 10 is they cleared the largest gap along Omaha Beach. And so E1 becomes the principal egress off of the Omaha Beach, meaning um, that is where really the war starts for pushing inland for American forces off of Omaha Beach, even though that sector um, is considered one of the bloodiest on D-Day. If we jump to the next slide here, uh, I want to highlight GAP Team 10. There's a memorial placed last year at the 80th anniversary in a section of the Roman ruins. And you can see WN 62 and 65 flanking and each end of that section of the beach, with the memorial right in the middle where the Roman ruins are. And this is dedicated really to Lieutenant Gregory and Ensign Karnowski and GAP Team 10. This memorial plaque was placed by uh, Lieutenant Gregory's family. So I've connected with the family. Lieutenant Gregory still buried in Elko, was decided not to be buried in Normandy American Cemetery. His remains were transferred to Elko, I think back in 1948, to be buried there. But these are one of the newer monuments. This was unveiled June 6th last year at the 80th anniversary. And so why I think a lot of the bigger memorials, cover the general swath of the beach and the actions there from, first ID and the 29th ID. you're seeing a lot more smaller unit and more dedication to some of these untold stories or underrepresented stories that you don't really hear about. I think more of the history nerds like myself, are digging across several volumes of books and research and data to kind of coalesce what the story is and tell it in a unified manner. But if you go to the next slide here, um, which you really see some of the other memorials dedicated to both the 5th and the 1st Engineering Special Brigades. And these special brigades are not just combat engineering related, it is part of the whole general engineering and beach battalion setup of bringing in supplies, building port facilities, machine shops, things like that to really be uh, to really oil the machine of war for our oncoming armies that are breaching Fortress Europe. To your left there, you see the 5th ESB Memorial on Omaha Beach. In the middle there is the 1st ESB Memorial that is just off Utah Beach. And then,
Beach. Yep.
yeah, and then the last picture on the right there is the NCDU Memorial off of Omaha Beach, just not far from the Normandy American Cemetery. This was debuted last year at the 80th anniversary, and it's a you can see that right there. There's a original Czech hedgehog um, obstacle that was there on D-Day, but the memorial is appropriate. It is well deserved, sponsored by the UDT Museum out of Fort Pierce and the U.S. Navy SEALs. But this is where they start to get recognition in the stories being told of this was the tip of the spear. They landed with the first units, and if not, in some cases, they were the first units on the beach in the daylight, going after obstacle throughout several hundred yards of uncovered and unfortified from an attacker's perspective. Um, Assault on the beach.
Yeah, I think more and more, if more and more people become torchbearers for some of these smaller units, like the fantastic detailed work you've done, specifically for Team 10, um, it'll enrich the historiography of the Normandy invasion greatly, and I'm glad you're able to come on and do the show. I had known a little bit about it. I had tried to do my homework in preparation so I could not sound like an idiot next to your expertise. So I hope everybody who's listened has gotten something out of this and enjoyed hearing the story that's not really well known and broadly told, unless you have somebody like yourself that does sit down with you or talk with you about it. Um, it was great to talk about Gregory and Karnowski and the work they did, but also to talk about the composition of the teams and the composition of the engineer special brigades and the how they evolved to what that level of expertise that they just displayed on D-Day, those very early nascent efforts all the way to this fully formed hybrid unit that could do this very specialized mission. Um, I think it's been a treat, especially for me, to sit here and talk with you about it.
I appreciate you having me on. I'm glad to be able to, like I said, be a torchbearer of history and share some of this knowledge. I probably could have spent, 2 more hours going into the nitty gritty details of the ESBs and, what they did through Normandy, because they take a big part of the logistical capacity of pushing those logistics inward. You talk about the Mulberry Harbors. They're part of that. The ESBs are part of that. They generally finish their operations toward the fall of 44 and start to get reassigned to back into the Mediterranean. Some of them start to go back home for retraining out in the Pacific, particularly ESB 1 They get to start to participate in the invasion of Okinawa, for their resources and their knowledge and expertise and just being combat veterans in that sense. But truly appreciate you having me on. I could talk for hours about this subject, and like I said,
Well,
get
I'm going to take you up on that. So at some
yeah,
point, let's get you back on so we can do another talk about the ESBs. I'm really stoked to talk about them in detail, like you talked about. I mean, this is a great, I think it whets the appetite for
yeah,
folks with this topic. But I know that there's plenty of history geeks like you and I that are glad to sit here and talk about compositions of engineer special brigades and the subunits attached to them, and not only that, the logistics, but and the transport of getting them to the battle space and them completing their operations, and how it facilitates, as we touched on during this, facilitates further operations going in. But I definitely going to want to get you back on again when you've got some time. Not now. You've already done a great job
yeah.
with this one, and I can't wait for this one. This one is going to
Looking
drop
forward
on
to it.
the 26th of March, and I hope everybody will you'll enjoy it. But thanks, Dev. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for the time. Appreciate it. Look forward to continuing the conversation in the future.
Without a doubt. Bye, everybody.